You might have heard before that autistic people tend to struggle with literal thinking, but did you know that's actually not listed as part of the criteria in the DSM? Oh, and the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's the diagnostic tool that is used in the US and elsewhere throughout the world. Yeah, literal thinking literally isn't in there. And so I'm wondering where this idea came from, and is it true? Hi, hello, my name is Megan, and I am an author, content creator, and life coach for autistic and ADHD adults like myself. And if you like content like this, you can get even more inside of my super affordable YouTube membership. The link to join will be in the description. But for now, let's dive into literal thinking. So I think we have to start with what the DSM actually says and how this has been interpreted to lead to this idea that autistic people are very, very literal. As a slight caveat, I'm not saying that if something is not in the DSM that it couldn't possibly be part of being autistic. We know that there's a lot of ongoing research that hasn't made its way into the DSM yet. And we know that there's lots of shared lived experiences that haven't even made it to the research yet. So just because something's not in the DSM doesn't mean it's not part of our experience as autistic people. But I think it's interesting because when people are just colloquially talking about autism, they often talk about literal thinking as though it is one of the main criteria in the DSM, and it's not. There are two main parts of the DSM criteria that I think have led to this idea of autistic literal thinking, and they are difficulties in sharing in imaginative play and rigid thinking patterns. Taken together, those 2 points kind of make it sound like autistic people lack imagination, and then we rigidly cling to our non-imaginative way of thinking, which can lead to very literal thinking. But here's the issue. Both of these points from the DSM are actually not criteria in and of themselves. They are examples of the criteria. Basically, the DSM has a couple main criteria, and then it lists some potential examples of how those criteria might show up in an autistic person's life. Difficulties in imaginative play is not listed as the criteria, it's listed as an example of the criteria. The criteria itself is about difficulties maintaining and developing relationships. And rigid thinking patterns is just one example of how an insistence on sameness might show up for an autistic person. I think if these examples, the difficulty with imaginative play, the rigid thinking patterns, if these were criteria and not examples, then I think it would make sense to say that most autistic people are going to be very, very literal. But because they are examples, and because there are lots of examples of how insistence on sameness or difficulty maintaining and developing relationships might show up, I don't think it makes sense to say that all autistic people are going to be very literal. But this is not me saying that autistic people can't be super literal or are never super literal. For some autistic people, our struggles with imagination, whether that's actually a lack of imagination or just difficulty communicating our imaginative world to others, those struggles can manifest in having a hard time picturing things or imagining things, and therefore communicating primarily through literal language. And if that is combined with rigid thinking patterns, that particular autistic person might have a really hard time with humor or metaphors or sarcasm. So just know, if you are an autistic person who takes everything very literally, you are so valid, and that makes so much sense given the criteria for autism. But if you're an autistic person who doesn't take things super literally, I don't want you thinking that you couldn't be autistic, because literal thinking is not listed as one of the criteria in the DSM. And there are other ways that difficulty with imaginative play and rigid thinking patterns could show up besides just literal thinking. In fact, some autistic people swing completely the other direction, and we rely very heavily on metaphors and analogies to communicate. This has been me for sure. I actually have my master's in poetry, in creative writing, and I have a hard time communicating in ways that's not metaphorical. Being literal is actually really difficult for me sometimes. And I think this adherence to metaphor can also represent those rigid thinking patterns. Instead of our rigid thinking patterns adhering to what's literally going on, sometimes we rigidly think in metaphors. Metaphor is the only way we can communicate, because when we think about what's literally happening, it doesn't seem to encapsulate what we're experiencing internally. Or if we experience something called alexithymia, which I have a lot of videos about, which you can watch here. Alexithymia is when you have a hard time identifying what it is that you're feeling. And so a metaphor just might explain it better. Basically, there's no one way to be autistic, and no one autistic person is more autistic than another autistic person. Now, that being said, some autistic people are more disabled by their autism than others, and that's like a really important thing we need to acknowledge, that even though, yes, we are all autistic and we all experience a lot of similar traits and we have more in common than not in common, at the same time, we experience different levels of privilege and different levels of disability. And we're all still autistic in our own ways. Very literal thinking can create challenges, for sure, but so can metaphorical thinking, at least in my experience. Although I will acknowledge that a lot of people who primarily communicate through metaphors are often praised for being thoughtful, intelligent, or poetic, whereas people who primarily communicate literally are often told that they're being annoying or deliberately difficult or something like that. So we should take that into account. I think literal thinking is one of those traits that I always just assumed was in the DSM because of the way everyone talks about it with such confidence that it is part of the autistic experience. So it was really interesting for me to do this deep dive on autistic literal thinking and realize that it actually doesn't always show up that way for every autistic person. Now I'm wondering, are there any other autistic traits that you've heard of or that are really popular that you want me to do a deep dive on? Because I kind of love doing this style of video and I would love to research some stuff for you. So if there are other autistic traits that you've heard about and you want to know more, let me know in the comments, and I will see you all next time.